Bill Birtles' doorstep last week, demanding he submit to questioning and informing him he was banned from leaving the country. Australian and Chinese officials negotiated for the travel ban to be lifted if Bill Birtles spoke to police. Birtles and Smith flew out of Shanghai on Monday night and have now landed in Sydney. Political reporter Matthew Doran joins us now from Parliament House in Canberra. Matt, g'day. So what can you tell us?
Well, it's a pretty remarkable story here, Joe. The last two Australian journalists working for Australian media in China have been rushed out of the country. We'll walk you through a bit of the timeline of events, and really the reason why we are reporting this now is that Bill Birtles from the ABC and the Australian Financial Review's Michael Smith have both landed in Sydney, so they are now safe there, hence why this story has just broken. DFAT contacted the ABC last week through the Managing Director, David Anderson, to alert the ABC of concerns about Bill Birtles' safety in China. Those concerns were also relayed to Bill in China by officials from Australia's embassy. The ABC started making arrangements to get Bill out of the country for a flight that was due to depart on Thursday morning. Further warnings came from DFAT and embassy officials in the days leading up to that, saying that the journalists did need to get out of the country because they had intelligence saying that he was potentially at risk. And it was while Bill was holding farewell drinks at his apartment at midnight, just before leaving the country, that 7 members of Chinese police arrived on his doorstep demanding that he submit to questioning. They said that they would be contacting him the following day to arrange a time to do so. Now, Bill Birtles has contacted the Australian Embassy and has arranged to be collected. He spent the next 4 days bunkered down in Australia's diplomatic compound in Beijing. The Chinese officials did get in touch with him and said that they wanted to talk to him. He said at the time that he was not prepared to do so because he did have fears for his personal safety. And that's where this really interesting diplomatic back and forth has kicked off between Australia and China, with Australian officials negotiating with Chinese officials to allow Chinese police to speak to Bill Birtles if they promised to revoke a travel ban that they had slapped on him. That ban meaning that he could not travel back to Australia. Now, Bill was questioned by police in the few days after that. On the early hours of yesterday morning, he was escorted on a plane by Australian consular officials from Beijing to Shanghai, where he awaited his plane back to Australia. It's a similar story for the Australian Financial Review's Mike Smith. He is based in Shanghai, or was based in Shanghai, and there was a similar chain of events leading up to his situation. He was questioned by Chinese officials last night before heading to Shanghai airport, and had spent the last few days in Australia's consulate in Shanghai. So a very concerning development here for the freedom of the press, but also for Australian media's footprint in China.
Yeah, so Matt, this is breaking news, so I'm not sure exactly how much you know or how much has been disclosed about what's happened, but you mentioned that Chinese police had spoken to Bill Birtles, or I think you said interviewed Bill Birtles and Michael Smith. Do we know what they were questioned about?
Well, our understanding is that the questioning, certainly of Bill Birtles, seemed to be something of a routine sort of exercise. There wasn't questioning about any of his journalism, there wasn't questioning about any of his conduct as such, and there was no indication that he was actually suspected of any crimes under Chinese law. That's the extent of what we know so far about the situation, but we do have a statement from the ABC, the Director of News, Gavin Morris, saying that the ABC has made the decision to pull Bill Birtles out of China because of advice from the Australian government. He goes further to say that the ABC does want to continue having a presence in China, that the bureau there is a vital part of the ABC's international news gathering efforts, and the ABC will be aiming to get back there as soon as possible. Also going on to say that the story of China and its relationship with Australia and in the region is incredibly vital. We know that there's been this back and forth between Australia and China, these tensions mounting over the last few months, arguably the last few years, and the behaviour being levelled towards journalists has been much more marked than usual. We had earlier this year China's decision to expel a number of US journalists, including an Australian journalist working for a US publication. That decision was made and was received a lot of criticism there as well. So this could be along the same sort of vein as that, some sort of tit-for-tat situation. But at the moment, it really is too early to start making those sort of connections between the cases. However, just based on what we've heard from Bill's own experience, is that there was no sort of suggestion that he was guilty of any crime or under suspicion of any crime there, and that the questioning, while of course having 7 Chinese police officers show up on your doorstep at midnight is certainly intimidating, there doesn't appear to have been a whole lot more to it at that stage.
And Matt, you mentioned the statement from the ABC News boss, talked of advice from the Australian government. What can you mentioned that briefly before, but what can you say about that advice from the Australian government?
Well, we know that DFAT has been ratcheting up its advice to all Australians who are in China, whether they be in the media, whether they be working over there. Obviously, no one can really travel over there for tourism pursuits at the moment because of coronavirus restrictions. But it was only a few months ago that DFAT started issuing warnings that Australian citizens could be at risk of arbitrary detention in China. In other words, they could be arrested by Chinese officials, detained for questioning on a purely ad hoc basis. There might not be any clear indication of wrongdoing or suspicion of any crimes, but that wasn't going to stop Chinese authorities from acting in that way. So that travel advice was issued a few months ago by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, really at the height of this discussion of Australia's relationship with China. It's gone from things like trade disputes, beef, barley, wine, the passage of Chinese students to Australia, with the Chinese government warning its students to reconsider studying in China. We've had a number of disputes over things like last week, the dairy deal, the decision to sell the $600 million sale of Lion, the brewer's dairy assets, to a Chinese buyer, held up because the government didn't believe it was in the national interest. And of course, last week as well, the revelations that an Australian journalist working for China state media, CGTN, Cheng Lai, she had been detained by Chinese authorities as well during this incredibly tense period. So the advice has been that there could be a risk to the personal safety of Australians, whether they are media or any other Australians for that matter in China. And certainly it's been enough to convince the ABC's management that the time was to get Bill Birtles out of the country, as well as management at the Australian Financial Review, part of the Nine newspaper group, to get Michael Smith out of Shanghai and back to safety here in Australia.
Okay, Matthew Doran in Canberra. So just repeating that breaking news before we go on to the coronavirus situation. 2 Australian journalists rushed out of China over concerns for their safety, and after they'd been asked for interviews by police. One of those is Bill Birtles, our ABC correspondent there in Beijing. I had a chat to him just last week after that Australian journalist working for China State TV had been detained. We'll see if we can get a chat with Bill at some stage with the news that he's back in Sydney now, but we'll be following that through the day, that breaking news that's just through. Now, it's another promising morning for Victoria today, with the second lowest number of new cases in months, but also a day tinged with sadness because yet more people have died. Reporter Steph Ferrier joins us now from Melbourne. Steph, g'day. So take us through this latest information that's just come through in the past half hour or so.
Hi Joe, yes, so we have another 55 new cases of coronavirus detected in the past 24 hours. That is slightly up on yesterday's number, which was the lowest since June the 26th of 41, so another 14 cases there. But the good sign is that that trajectory is still continuing down. Our 14-day average now is 84. It was around 84.8 yesterday, so it is remaining steady. Just on the 7-day average figures, we're now down to 74 new cases over the past 7 days compared with 104 a week prior to that. So that does show that we are on the right path. Sadly, as you mentioned, another 8 deaths. We're obviously going to get breakdowns of whether or not they occurred yesterday or prior to that with these changes in federal government reporting regulations from aged care sectors, and just also how many of those relate to aged care. But that does increase our state's toll from coronavirus to 683. At least those new cases, as I said, do show that we are going slowly down to hit that benchmark that we are required of fewer than 50 new cases in order to move to the next stage post this extra 2-week lockdown. And we do have obviously some promising signs from yesterday. We're still to get some of these updated figures, of course, that will come out in the press conference with Daniel Andrews at some stage later. But yesterday we had just 1,780 cases that are active across Victoria, and only importantly, an extra 4 cases in community transmission. So hopefully those community transmission numbers will remain low as well.
And Steph, there's this ongoing disagreement between the federal and Victorian governments over the effectiveness of Victoria's contact tracing system. Where's that at?
Yeah, so the health authorities here and the Premier Daniel Andrews have been quick to jump to defend our contact tracing system after it copped a bit of criticism from the federal government, as well as some experts who say that it simply hasn't been up to the job. Now, Scott Morrison and this nation's former Chief Medical Officer, Professor Brendan Murphy, both put up New South Wales as the gold standard. They say that that state has a very decentralised system with a lot of networks embedded within the local health districts, which does help to get on top of contact tracing very quickly. And in fact, the Health Minister, Greg Hunt, this morning said that Victoria especially needs to be more transparent.
What has to be done is each case every day, not just with an initial contact, but to work to have all of the contacts of the positive case identified and reached, to be able to make sure that the data is published daily, that the sites where the cases have been identified are released publicly, as New South Wales does, in terms of whether it's a public transport route, whether it's a restaurant, whether it's a gymnasium, whether it's a shopping centre.
And so the Premier, Daniel Andrews, was quick in his defence. He says that we are getting to most cases within 24 hours, and in fact 100% of close contacts of those positive cases within 48 hours, which is aligning with the national benchmarks. He does, of course, say that there's always room for improvement, so they are looking at artificial intelligence to help enhance this contact tracing system. And he's also hinted at yet another rescue package for hard-hit businesses that are really doing it tough after consultations with industry sectors, especially those businesses that are going to have to stay closed until at least late October and possibly even beyond as a result of this very stringent roadmap we have here. That, of course, all depends on those numbers coming down, as I mentioned, so at least we are on the right track. But Scott Morrison says that with these really tough thresholds, even Sydney would be in lockdown, and of course it isn't at the moment. Greg Hunt has even referred to or likened it to Wuhan, saying that even in Wuhan in China, we didn't have as long lockdowns as we are facing in Melbourne here. But the Premier says that Sydney is a completely different situation.
Sydney's not had the amount of community transmission that we've had, so I don't think that's a particularly valid comparison and not a particularly worthwhile one. We're not in New South Wales. We've got a set of unique circumstances that apply to Victoria and a roadmap to safely and steadily ease out of these current rules, these current restrictions, to find a COVID normal, to open up and to stay open.
He says the fact that we have gone down from 725 to well under, 41 and then 55 in the past couple of days shows that this strategy is working. Brett Sutton has given us a glimmer of hope as well. He says not so much this extra 2-week lockdown, that's set in stone, but the second step after that, October 26, if we manage to get to 5 new cases or fewer, then there is the possibility that businesses and kids going back to school might happen earlier than that date. So that's some hope for us here.
And Steph, breaches at the hotel quarantine set up there in Victoria have been identified.